The first spot that you're going to want to look at when you are looking at your podcast stats and kind of trying to get an idea of what your statistics actually mean and how to kind of decipher them is to look at your stats as a whole from your podcast host. Your podcast host is where all of the podcast players go to pull your podcast. And so they are going to have the most accurate number of total downloads. Welcome to another episode of Listeners to Leads, where I'm helping podcasters launch and maintain a lead generating show. I'm your host, Alicia Galati, the CEO and head podcast strategist behind Galati Media, a full-service podcast management company. On this show, you'll hear my guests and I discuss everything it takes to launch a successful podcast and keep it running. If you're ready to get leads, land speaking gigs, and create deeper connections with your audience through your podcast, then this is the show for you. I'm nervous about this episode because I feel like it might get a little ranty and ravey, so bear with me. I had to kind of deal with the situation last week. A client of ours reached out and she said, Alicia, I am getting an increase in downloads, but my listener score went down. Why? And then angry emoji face. So I asked her, where in the world are you getting this information from? I'm not seeing this information anywhere. So where in the world are you getting it from? And she said that she was getting it from Listen Notes. And I was like, well, duh. Of course, Listen Notes is going to say that your listen score went down, even though when you look at your stats, they've gone up. And so today we're going to kind of walk through what to look for in your podcast stats. We have a podcast episode called Podcast Stats, What They Mean and How to Measure Success. But we're going to go a little deeper because obviously that was done August of last year. So there's new information that I can share with you and kind of give you some tidbits and some tricks and some strategies. So if you want to listen to that, that gives you what those stats mean, the different statistical platforms that you can look at, and how to actually measure the success of your podcast. But we're going to go a little deeper in this one, and you'll notice that I'm going to start doing this with the podcast episodes. You might remember from episode 53, where I talked about going deep instead of wide with your podcast content. So kind of taking past content that you've talked about, especially after you get about a year in, and going deeper on it, because it doesn't matter how often your audience hears something, they tend to need to hear it quite a few times before it actually sinks in. All right, so the first spot that you're going to want to look at when you are looking at your podcast stats and kind of trying to get an idea of what your statistics actually mean and how to kind of decipher them is to look at your stats as a whole from your podcast host. Your podcast host is where all of the podcast players go to pull your podcast. And so they are going to have the most accurate number of total downloads. Now, in the case of my client, when she said, I found this information on Listen Notes, I was able to look at her podcast stats on Buzzsprout. So we use Buzzsprout. I highly recommend them, love them. If you are looking for a podcast host, they're great for beginners. They're great for advanced podcasters. Either way, absolutely love them. You can go to aliciagalati.com/Buzzsprout and you can get a $25 Amazon gift card. After being with them, I believe it's for 3 months. And then I get a little kickback and everybody wins. Win-win. When I looked at the Buzzsprout stats, I was able to see, okay, what are her top apps that people are actually using to listen to her podcast? And so I went to the apps and devices, and most of your podcast hosts are going to have this information. So I went to her apps and devices, and then I looked at all her episodes. So usually it ends up configuring and like auto-populating the last 5 episodes, the last 30 days, things like that. I want to look at everything. So generally speaking, where does Listen Notes fall in this information? And when I looked, I didn't see Listen Notes on her list at all, which tells me that most of her podcast listeners are not listening on Listen Notes. And so what they give her as scores or what they give her as valuable information isn't actually valuable or beneficial. And it makes her feel like trash, which is like, no, hello, absolutely not. You are doing incredible. Your stats are saying incredible things. So you know what? Like, don't listen to him. Don't listen to that guy, right? So when I looked at her stuff, I said, okay, your top listening app is actually Apple Podcast, Spotify, and people listening on Buzzsprout, which is the podcast host. So people are getting sent to her Buzzsprout page. They're listening there. People are listening on Apple Podcasts, and they're listening on Spotify. Now, the difference in numbers is pretty astronomical right now, and I kind of have an idea why. I'm going to have to yell at her for this, but 69% of her listeners are using Apple of all her podcast apps. And so that tells me that most likely, and I know this because I know her, she is exclusively sharing her Apple Podcast link. And we've talked about this before on the podcast, but I'm going to reiterate it again. You should not be sharing one podcast listening app link. You should be sharing it where people can pick and choose what app they like to listen to. If you make it more difficult for the listeners to find their app or to find your podcast on their app, then they're less likely to actually take the time to search for your podcast in their app of choice. So in the case of Buzzsprout and most of the other podcast apps, you can actually send them your podcast page, and then you're able to give them that link. Good, awesome. They can pick which app they want to listen through. So I believe that's what's happening here. And it would not surprise me because I've yelled at her about this before. And when I say I yelled at her, she's also one of my biz besties. And so, yes, she hires me to do this. Yes, she's one of my best friends. And I will yell at her if I need to. That's the kind of relationship we have. I don't yell at my clients. And generally speaking, I'm not yelling at her anyway. I'm just like, listen, kind of shaking her a little bit. We don't need to share only your podcast app that you like. We don't need to be looking at podcast apps and their information when it doesn't even make sense or is even relevant for your show. Back to what we're looking at here. So I looked at the podcast apps, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and then I was able to see, okay, how many followers does she have on Apple Podcasts? How has that grown over the last year? Incredible. How many followers does she have on Spotify? How has that grown over the last year? Incredible. Those are the stats that you want to look at, the stats that are actually relevant to what your podcast is doing and how it's growing. So when you look at something like Listen Notes, unless Listen Notes is a top 10 podcast app for your listeners, then I honestly wouldn't even really be looking at it. It just tells me that most people aren't using that app, and any information they give is based solely on the information that they have available to them, not the information that we have available as a whole from our podcast host. One of the things that I'm not sure we touched on last time, but I think is also really important, is once you have about 3 to 6 months worth of podcast data, then it's good to look kind of a little deeper and looking at the nitty-gritty of each of those podcast listening apps. Then you're able to get some more information from your audience. You can figure out your audience demographics that way. It makes it so much easier to kind of get a better idea of who is listening, what age range are they in. Maybe your podcast app even has information like how much money they make or how many podcasts they're following as well, or what similar podcasts that your audience is currently following. That is the information that is going to be key in understanding, okay, what are my listeners like? Who are these people who are subscribing, who are listening to my show? So that's where things like Buzzsprout aren't usually going to have that information because they don't have, and this goes into like user security and privacy. When you are on Spotify, you tend to fill out, okay, this is my age range. This is the type of music I'm listening to. This is my demographic. Great. They already have that information and they have specifically gotten that information from their users. Buzzsprout cannot go in and view that information because of the user's privacy. So that's where it's important to kind of dig a little deeper. And so looking at your top apps. So for the one client, her top apps were Apple Podcast, Spotify, and her Buzzsprout player. For another client, hers were Spotify first, Apple Podcasts next, then Google Podcasts. And for Google Podcasts, you can even get even more information about what your users are searching for. Oh, I get jazzed. I know I say jazzed a lot on this podcast. Y'all are just going to have to like get jazzed with me. I get so jazzed when I can look into the data and kind of figure out who these people are, the things that they're searching for, the things that are coming up, the episodes that are coming up. So we're going to look at my podcast manager on Google Podcasts real quick. I'm going to kind of walk you through what I'm looking at. So I have a very small podcast here. And this goes back to like, the cobbler's shoes are always terrible because she's busy fixing everybody else's shoes. Yes, that is me. I am the cobbler in that story. I admit it. I do not spend nearly as much time promoting my podcast as I should. And I know that I need to, and I'm working on slowly but surely, just like I tell you guys, building up on that, starting to hand over more things to my team. But at this point, we're not there yet. I have 5 total subscribers on Google Podcasts, and then I can look and see which ones were played in the last 30 days, how much of the podcast was played, which I think is really important to see, what devices those people were using, and then this is where it gets fun. The total traffic from Google searches. Hoorah! Yes, I love this information. I can see that my impressions were 687. That means that my podcast showed up in 687 searches as one of the things that people were looking for. So I can use this information, this statistic, this data to then say, okay, well, Google, what were those searches? I want to know. They can tell me based on the impressions. The first search was monetizing your podcast. So that tells me that I need to use that key phrase and that topic in a future episode to show up higher on those searches. That is important and valuable information to me. Letting me know that my listener score is down, not valuable or important information for me. But seeing these stats, seeing this data to kind of guide my content, to guide my decisions, that is valuable. So, number 1, monetizing your podcast. Number 2, how to monetize your podcast. Number 3, podcast listening platforms. Number 4, podcast audience. Number 5, how to get podcast listeners. And it goes on and on. Number 7 was podcast listening statistics. So this episode is probably going to have that phrase quite often in the copy, in the show notes, on my website. That is going to be the long tail keyword that I use so that when people are searching for podcast listening statistics, it makes it easy for Google to recommend my podcast and talk about, hey, this is a podcast that has information that you're looking for. So I challenge you today to take a step further into your podcast stats than just, oh, yay, I got 1,000 downloads in the last month. Great. What does that tell you? It doesn't really tell you anything other than you've got 1,000 downloads. How long do those people listen for? And that is kind of leading to my next thing, which I think is equally important. And that is using this information to make better decisions for your podcast. So I recently talked to a potential client, and he has a podcast that runs about an hour and a half long. And I said, if we work together, one of the things that I would like to see, because generally speaking, podcasts tend to be around 30 to 45 minutes, according to statistics. That is where the majority of them land, at least on Buzzsprout. So when you're stacking your podcast against others, using that information to say, okay, most people are keeping it around this time, but how long is my audience actually listening? So you got one piece of information telling you 30 to 45 minutes. Cool. But where do people tend to drop off on my show? And I would personally say, look at that 50% drop from the start. So if it starts at one point and then 50% of them drop off at, say, you have a 30-minute podcast and 50% of them continuously drop off at 20 minutes, maybe you need your podcast to be closer to 20 minutes than 30 minutes. That is where I mean using this information to make better decisions. So I told this potential client, one of the things that I'd like to use one of our strategy sessions for is determining, what are your statistics telling you? Do you need to cut your show? Do you need it to be shorter? Is the length great for your audience? Are they coming back and listening to the rest? That is valuable and important information for him to make better decisions about his podcast and about his content. So when we're looking at these podcast stats, yes, it's cool to be like, oh, my listener score is this, or my click-through rate on Google Podcasts is this. But let's take it a step further and make decisions for our podcasts based on these podcast stats. I hope this was valuable, didn't feel too overwhelming for you. So I'm going to give you some action items because I feel like we talked about a lot. Number one, I want you to look at your general podcast stats on your podcast. What does it tell you? Look at your top 5 podcast listening apps that your audience is listening to your podcast on. Then dig into each of those. What is the information telling you? Where do people drop off? What is their demographic? What are those things that they're searching for? What are their interests? That is going to give you such a wealth of information, and you're going to be able to make better decisions for your podcast based on that. All right. I hope this was helpful, and I hope that these action items can inspire you to do these things, to take action, to really look at your stats with an open eye and as data, really. I don't have great stats on my podcast, and I look at it as data. Where can I improve? How can I make changes? How can I do better? And we do this for our clients constantly. And we've been doing it a lot over the summer, especially with the summer lull in downloads, and just ensuring that they know what's happening with their podcast and we can make decisions together that are beneficial for the growth of the shows. All right. If you need help or support with this, hit me up. We have podcast strategy sessions. I can spend an hour digging through your stats with you, kind of getting that information, figuring it out with you, and giving you my advice on how to improve your show. We'll have the link for that in the show notes. Other than that, have a fantastic rest of your week, and I will see you next time. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Listeners to Leads. If you found something in this episode valuable, I would really appreciate it if you shared it with a friend who you know would also get value from it. Want to send me a message? My favorite place to hang out is Instagram. You can find me at alicia.galati. Let me know what your favorite takeaway was from the episode. And don't forget, turning those listeners into leads is actually easy.